So when it comes to the Cold War, there's going to be a beta for PlayStation. The next week is going to be pretty much for all platforms. Then Tony Flame put out a tweet basically saying they've already enhanced the Gunsmith from the alpha, and that was already an improved version of what we've seen in Modern Warfare. So I'm going to talk about some of these changes and how they're going to affect the way the gun systems work for the better. If you do enjoy the video or learn something anyway, please do me a favor, hit that like button. Goal in today's video is 3,000 likes, so hopefully you can help me hit that number. And if you're brand new, looking to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, just make sure you subscribe with notifications on by hitting the red subscribe button and ringing that bell to make sure you're up to date with my future videos. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tweet. I went ahead and asked him a question, and then there was a little bit of confusion after that, so I'm going to clear that part up and how it applies to Modern Warfare and one of the biggest issues with the Gunsmith in my opinion. So here's the tweet. It said, if you like the Gunsmith stat percentage readouts for attachments in the alpha, just wait until you see the layer of depth in the beta of the Gunsmith. And then I went on to ask, I said, bring in the fire. I said, also, can you speak to whether or not the attachments are going to be additive or multiplicative? And a lot of people seem to be a little bit confused by that. He ended up actually responding to me. That's very rare that devs respond when I ask questions. So he says additive, and for most people they don't really think much of that, but that ends up changing a lot of the mechanics to simplify them, and it makes the game easier to balance. And let's go ahead and talk about how that works within Modern Warfare. So the way the Modern Warfare Gunsmith works is it actually has kind of like a hybrid system here, where sometimes it's additive, sometimes it's multiplicative, and sometimes it's a combination of both, which can get a little confusing because, for example, if you're not really sure what that means, I'm going to break it down specifically. But for example, when I go to the monolithic suppressor, it increases your range by approximately 7.5%. But that 7.5% is multiplied by the barrel. So for example, if it was just 30%, it's going to be multiplied together. So instead of simple math where this attachment increases your range by 20 meters and this one increases it by 10, the combination should be 30, right? 10 plus 20 is 30. In this game, sometimes it works that way and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on what stat you're talking about. So in this specific example, you would end up multiplying 10 meters and 20 meters by the percents, and you'd end up with something along the lines of like 34 meters or something like that. And that's not very intuitive for the average person, because what ends up happening is if I already have my class set up here, say I put on the tac laser, and I decide to put on a heavier mag that makes me a little bit slower on the ADS, well, that amount that changed with the mag also somehow impacted the laser because it multiplies out and it gets a little bit confusing. And then there's an additive part where sometimes when it's plus, it does a certain attribute, and sometimes when it's minus, it does it a different way, which makes it incredibly confusing when you're trying to create a class. Because if this thing just says plus 10% and that's it, and then this one says plus 20%, you just add those together. Very simple. And at the end, if your ADS speed's improved by 30% and you have a 300 millisecond ADS speed, then you'd subtract 90 milliseconds. Pretty straightforward, but I'm going to go ahead and break it down so it's a little bit easier to explain and why this is actually a good thing in terms of balance. So I pulled this from truegamedata.com, and that's kind of where you could just test different stats of the weapon. This is an M4 build using the attachments you can see right here: monolithic suppressor, M16, the tac laser, the commando foregrip, 60 round mag, and then you end up with the final number. In some cases it does multiplicative, and then sometimes it does additive, which can be a little confusing because most people don't even know the difference between those two, let alone how they're going to stack on the weapon to make a loadout. And they use a combination of both, and you're going to see that here. So in this first example, the range modifier for the monolithic is 10%, which kind of we were talking about a little bit earlier. 40% for the M16 barrel. So in addition, they would just go up to 50% addition, right? But they end up with 54 because you multiply them together. So in some scenarios where the number is incredibly high, it can have an even significant impact when you stack it with something that's like 15%, 20%, and it becomes incredibly hard to balance because literally you're balancing every attachment against every other attachment, which can end up with some tricky scenarios. And that's why you end up with such a strong meta towards certain attachments, because that specific combination leads to the best results because of how all the numbers multiply together. Versus if they were additive, you might end up with a little bit more balance between the attachments because changing one attachment wouldn't so strongly impact the other attachment. So right here, you end up with 54%, which is what he has right here for the final stat. And the additive, you'd end up with 50%, which is a little bit less, right? So with the ADS speed, it gets a little bit tricky here because it uses multiplicative and additive. And that even gets more confusing because of the way the attachments stack. So you basically combine all the negative attributes right here and you combine them out. It should be 293 milliseconds. And even if you just did strict additive, you'd end up with 300 milliseconds. But in this case, you end up with 313. That's because you combine all the negatives, multiply them together, and then you have the tack laser by itself, which if there was other positive ones like a stock or whatever, a no stock, which made it faster ADS, you'd combine those ones and then you add those together. And that ends up with the result that is different than these because it's a combination. So this is the current system that people love, but they don't really understand. And I think switching over this new system is going to be much better. And that's in addition to having a little bit more precision. They're probably going to tell us a little bit more about the weapons, maybe the fire rate. Hopefully we get that type of stuff. So you don't even got to go in and test anything. You know exactly what it is. And it tells you exactly what it is. And it adds all up, sums it up at the end. And you get like a snapshot similar to this, but within the game. And it to be accurate. That's the key. There's plenty of things where if you put on FMJ, it's going to increase your damage bar. You put on sleight of hand, increases your fire rate on the stats, even though in reality, it's not doing either of those things in a practical sense. So for movement speed, it ends up being multiplicative. Right here, you can combine all these numbers, multiply them out. You end up with 426 from 4703, and that's what you would get right here. Versus if we did it, it'd only be a slight difference because these are very small numbers, but you'd end up with a slight difference here since all these are under like 5. It's not a huge difference, but you start ending up with attachments that are 15, 20, 15, 20. A lot of those numbers start to fly out and separate each other's depending if you're doing multiplicative or additive. And then we also have movement speed. That one ends up being ADS movement speed ends up being additive. It's slightly off here. You can see it's right at 1.8 over here on the right. And then 1.82 if we did multiplicative. So you end up with different values throughout the entire list here just because of how they've decided to do their overall stats in the game. It's just not practical. It's just too confusing for the average person. Even though I'm talking now and explaining it, it might even be too confusing then. We have a vertical recoil we could have done. You can see those are additive. Currently, but they could be multiplicative, right? Like, hey, you know what? When you combine this particular attachment, that one, it just ends up with too many variables. Or are you combining the vertical recoil, the horizontal bounce, or the, you know, what numbers are you combining? Because it ends up being a little bit weird. And then bullet stabilization, how does that factor in? It's just a lot going on, and it just makes it too confusing for the average person. Right here, bullet velocity. We have 720 meters per second. You get a boost with the monolithic suppressor and the M16 barrel. And this one ends up being multiplicative. So when you combine these numbers, very similar to the range where they stack on top of each other. So if you're dealing with 25% and 25%, it's a huge increase. And more than maybe planned. And that's where the game gets a little bit hard to balance because you can't really just tweak one attachment. Because literally if you nerf this one attachment, and people tend to combine these two attachments, now you've essentially nerfed this one because this one combines with that attachment. So you end up with a lot of these little variables where it just makes it so the game gets incredibly hard to balance, especially when you're talking about 70 attachments that intermingle with each other. This way, they've confirmed it's going to be additive, meaning that it's pretty straightforward. You see 10%, 40%, it equals 50%. Straightforward across the board. These ones, whatever percentages they would end up being, you'd end up with that percent difference, 26% when you do the math out, and 300 milliseconds, which ends up being a little bit faster than this particular scenario. But as we go through, you would see kind of how that works, and you'd end up with less odd occurrences where, oh, when you equip this attachment on this weapon, it's way better because of this X, Y, and Z of the other combination of attachments. So I thought I'd explain that for you because I got a lot of questions over on Twitter when I asked the question, and then more importantly, actually answered to confirm it. I'm really looking forward. Hopefully they do a snapshot very similar to what they've done on this site, so that once you already build the class, it's literally right there and you can compare a class head to head and kind of min-max against each other. And then they could always balance and tweak so that one class setup doesn't become so much better than everything else, that is all people use, because that's been kind of the issue with Modern Warfare. And that's why so many players on their rifles use commando foregrip. Everyone's used the monolithic suppressor. longest barrel, the VLK, like it's kind of like it's already been min-maxed, but when you have more balance between them and they're additive, it's a little bit easier for them to fine tune these percentages, and it lines up to the numbers that they're actually trying to achieve versus, oh, but we didn't account for that one extreme scenario where someone combined this, and this, and it multiplies all those to add up to a higher number than we expected. And you end up with broken meta. So hopefully that makes sense. Enjoy the video, learn something new. If you did, please do me a favor, hit that like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Appreciate all the support on the channel. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.